Good evening. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to Pike Place Market on this beautiful Friday evening. My name is Emily Crawford. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing for Pike Place Market. And I'm so glad to see you all here this evening. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the Smithsonian's American beer historian, who's here tonight all the way from the East Coast to talk with us and a panel of brilliant beer aficionados and brewers and growers here tonight at Pike Place Market. So please give a warm Pike Place Market welcome to Teresa McCullough of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History.
Thank you. And at this time, I'd like to invite our panelists up because I'm not talking to you tonight. It's going to be these wonderful panelists who are involved in the story of Seattle brewing. So if I could ask Charles and Roseanne and Dave and Dick and Annie, please. Hi, Roseanne.
You sure you want me?
Absolutely. We need to hear your voice. Charles, you want
I know, to get beer for everyone.
Okay, that sounds good. Charles just went to find some. Okay.
Oh, okay. Oh, good. So if I clear my throat or something, I'm not. Did you give him the same instructions? He's not terribly technological.
I think we'll reiterate.
Now it's on. Show me. Yeah, turn it off. Turn it off.
I was just told, you just gotta just push that leave it on all the whole time?
No, we're turning on and off, so we don't have to do you guys chatting behind the Exactly. Thank you.
Okay, good evening. Welcome to this American History After Hours event. As Emily mentioned, I am Teresa McCullough, and I am the historian of the American Brewing History Initiative, which is a project at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. And I'm very pleased that my job is to collect objects and documents and stories related to the history of beer and brewing in America. And the goal of this initiative is to create a permanent and prominent role for the story of American beer and brewing in the museum's archival collections and exhibitions. Yes. This evening's event and the larger Brewing History Initiative are possible only because of the generous support of the Brewers Association, which, as many of you know very well, is the not-for-profit trade association that promotes and protects craft brewers, their beer, and their communities. Paul Gatza, director of the BA, and Adam Dooley, executive chef of the BA, are here this evening, so please thank them. I have a few more thank yous before we begin. I want to say my first thank yous to these panelists for being here this evening. Several of them traveled in from out of town to be with us. I also want to thank Charles and Roseanne, Chris Moore and Brian Stan, and also Annie Johnson for donating the beer that we're enjoying this evening. Thank you also to Old Stove for putting on the beautiful happy hour we had earlier at their market front location where we enjoyed the sunset and their beer. Thank you to Emily Crawford and her team and Chef Tracy Calderon of Atrium Kitchen, Emily and her team at Pike Place Market. Yeah. And last but not least, thank you to all of you for coming out on your Friday evening to enjoy beer and to eat and to learn and to participate with us. So just to give you an idea, I'm going to very, very briefly introduce our speakers, and then we're going to have a conversation of just about 45 minutes, and at the tail end of that, I would love to invite you to participate, to ask your questions of our wonderful panelists, and so please think of how you would like to contribute to the conversation as we speak. Afterward, there's going to be plenty of time to eat and drink and chat with our guests. And then at the end of the event at 8:30, Pike Brewing has very generously reserved some space for us to continue the conversation at a kind of post-event happy hour. So please plan to come over there if you are still interested in speaking. And lastly, if you'd like to learn more about the work of the American Brewing History Initiative, you can go to our museum's website, which is americanhistory.si.edu. Follow us on social media, and please come and visit us in DC. We're on the National Mall. We are free and open to the public, and as we like to say, you are always welcome at your National Museum of American History. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our panelists, and let's begin. Charles Finkel and Roseanne Finkel are co-founders and co-owners of Pike Brewing. They have built extensive careers in the import and sale of specialty foods, wine, and beer. They are responsible for introducing American consumers to many fine European and American craft beers, and Charles is also an artist and designer. Dave Green is president and CEO of Skagit Valley Malting. He has more than 30 years of experience in the food processing industry. Skagit Valley Malting sources grains from local growers and expertly malts them for brewers, distillers, bakers, chefs, and many other consumers. Dick Cantwell is head of brewing operations at Magnolia Brewing Company in San Francisco. He co-founded Seattle's Elysian Brewing Company. He is also a writer and has co-authored or authored books on barley wine, wood, and beer, and other subjects. His book, Brewing Eclectic IPA, will be published in spring of 2018. And Annie Johnson is Master Brewer in Residence at Pico Brew. She is a nationally ranked judge for the Beer Judge Certification Program. A longtime homebrewer, in 2013, she won the prestigious Homebrewer of the Year award from the American Homebrewers Association. So as we know, the theme of our conversation this evening is Seattle brewing, craft, culture, and history. I think it's appropriate that we're meeting here in Pike Place Market because this market is a culinary and a cultural institution that is very much embedded in the city of Seattle. When you come here, you understand that this place is very much tied to the region around it through forces of geography, seasonality, and history. And in many ways, that is how beer works. The brewing culture of a region or a city, for example, develops because of how that area is constructed over time, which groups of people come to it, and the kinds of agricultural and even transportation networks that it belongs to. The focus of my position as brewing historian at the Smithsonian is nationwide, but almost immediately as I began my research, it became very clear to me the extent to which the Pacific Northwest, and specifically Seattle, has a truly distinctive story with respect to beer and brewing. And as I've traveled around your city a bit in the past week, meeting brewers and other figures in the industry, everyone actually has a different answer to this question. And so that is where I would like to begin this evening. I would like to ask our panelists, what makes the brewing culture of Seattle unique, and why is that so? So please jump in and remember to push your microphone as you do.
Well, what strikes me off the bat is that the whole farm to table thing that's become such a huge thing. For us, we've been fortunate. This is something that's kind of obvious to us. With a resource like the market and the proximity of the hop fields in Yakima, and so much malting barley being grown nearby, when people talk about, oh yeah, we're doing a beer or we're doing a menu that takes place within 100 miles. And for us, over these years, we've been fortunate enough to be able to say, yeah, okay, we get that. We do that all the time. But I think that's something that's really embedded in our culture, culinarily and with regard to beer. So, first reactions, I'm sure others have others.
Kristen's right here. Well, for one thing, we've been described as anarchists out here, and the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, we don't always follow the rules. And the rule that we didn't follow was that home brewing was illegal in America, and remained so until Jimmy Carter, whose brother was a famous beer drinker, signed a law that allowed home brewing, people to brew. A married couple could brew 200 gallons, and an individual could brew 100 gallons. And that was as recently as 1978. But by 1978, home brewing was well established, in part thanks to Fred Eckert in Portland, but many other people preceding him. And here in Seattle and Alaska, they were and continue to be the hotbeds of home brewing in America. And Dick's right, the Pike Place Market. There's no place in America that has a shrine to food like the Pike Place Market. Go to San Francisco, it's the Golden Gate Bridge. Maybe now it's Magnolia Brewing Company. If you go to San Antonio, it's the Alamo. To New York, the Empire State Building. But right here is a shrine to food where people come from all over the world. About 14 million last year come to the Pike Place Market and explore the great variety of foods that we have locally and that we bring in from other areas. So all those contributed to a great environment to sell beer, to drink beer.
Yeah, I'd like to add on that. What I've seen is in Seattle, you can be anything you want to be. I love the diversity and the breweries. And what I really like is how the breweries help each other. And where I live and where I work, it's a 3-mile span. There's 13 breweries, and they're all friends, and it's super cool. So that's my favorite thing. And there's I see Brad and Laura here from Stoop Brewing, and I know for a long time they were helping Barry wash kegs at Lucky Envelope 2 blocks away. So even though they're all in the same business and they have a bottom line, just the helping is wonderful. And the way that they embrace the homebrewing community, because there are several of them that started from there. So it's a cool thing. So is that guy's sweater in the back.
You let your light shine. Yeah, I see it from a little different perspective as a malt supplier, and it's interesting that Seattle's only an hour away from Burlington, where our malt is grown. All our grains are grown in that area, and we've really been able to discover that there's a difference between in the growing conditions. It's a bit like the terroir of grapes in wine, probably not to the same extent, but it certainly has an influence on that. So we see the brewers come through our facility and the brewers that we work with, and there's just a really incredible spirit of cooperation amongst the brewers. They don't act like they are competitors very often, and we see a lot of collaborations that are really fascinating. So there's something special about the camaraderie, I think, that exists in the brewing community in this area.
And Dave, I wonder, I'd like to speak to the agricultural history of the region, but for the benefit of those here, could you describe specifically what does a maltster do? What is his or her role in the brewing process?
Yeah, so malt is interesting. We do lots of tours in our facility, and sometimes I forget who I'm talking to, and I go on for my half an hour through my speech. Some poor person in the back of the tour will raise their hand and, what's malt? So we need to explain that. And malt is short for maltose, a sugar. There are many sugars, and our job is to take grain, raw grain that we've carefully stored and cultivated, and convert the starches to sugars. It's the simplest way to explain it. And we make those sugars available to the brewers, so then, of course, they can derive alcohol from that and some very tasty beer. So it sounds like a simple process. The really unsatisfying part of malting is that we start with this beautiful grain, and when we get done, it looks exactly the same. And it takes a week to do that. It takes 7 days to get to that point, but it certainly doesn't taste the same. And so we've actually developed our own malting process, our own proprietary equipment. The guys that started the company, there's a guy named Wayne Carpenter who's the founder of our company, and really interesting entrepreneur. And he was interested in creating a higher value in grain. There's a lot of grain grown in Skagit Valley that kind of didn't have a place other than it was a rotation crop. So when high value crops are grown, grains are brought in for a couple of years to restore the soil and to break disease cycles in those high value crops. And the growers historically have had to sell those at commodity prices, and a lot of times they did not recoup even their own costs for raising that crop. So the original idea was to create a value-added item. And so the idea was that take these grains to some of the big malting companies and turn that into a value-added item in malt. Well, the big commodity malting companies all sort of had the same answer. It's like, well, where are you from? You guys don't grow grain in Skagit County. I don't even know where that is. And so Wayne is a really interesting guy who doesn't take no for an answer, and he literally locked himself in his garage with a bunch of his buddies who were very smart engineers and technical guys, and they built their own first malt machine, and it turned out to work really exceedingly well. That led to the development of the equipment that we use today, which is really unique. The entire malting process takes place in a single vessel without moving the grain from one vessel to another. And so we're able to do some really unique things with malt that other operations aren't able to do. And we like to bend our malting process around the grain and revere the grain as opposed to forcing the grain to fit through a set process. So we're able to bring things to the beer industry that are historically really hadn't been available.
Great, okay. And I wonder if the other panelists, you are brewers, how do you work with growers or with maltsters? Could you describe your relationships a little bit with those figures in your business?
Well, when I started in the craft brewing industry, we had relationships with fairly large maltsters, and even then we were able to have dialogues with them. But I think it's important to recognize that that in the last several years, maltsters like the Skagit Valley Malting Company are popping up all over the country, and people are doing things with malt varieties that aren't really being produced by the larger maltsters, and there's so much variety coming up. I mean, each region is able to produce really unique stuff, and the dialogue that goes on between brewers and maltsters is enormously enriching. It's something that we really didn't even have 20, 15, even 10 years ago, and it's something that we really, I think most of the consumers are not even aware that stuff like this is going on. But the last Elysian beer I brewed was with Skagit Valley malt, and now down in San Francisco, I'm working with another local maltster called Admiral. There are other ones that are all over the place, and these, it's really the outgrowth of the same kind of artisanal movement that has brought us quality bread and quality chocolate and quality beer and wine and everything else. So I'm not quite sure how to wrap that up, but it's a really terrific development that's happened over the last few years.
I'd like to comment on that because when we started brewing, I mean, we collectively, all craft brewers, we only had available malt from these large malting companies that existed primarily to supply the mass market American brewers their malt. And similarly, equipment manufacturers were set up to supply large brewers, not craft breweries. So a lot of early craft brewers, Mike Hale's here, he may have been one of them. Mike, where are you? Did you concoct your first equipment from dairy tanks or something? Yeah, because there just was no place to go 30 years ago when Hale's Brewery was founded to source not only the raw material, but the equipment too. And one thing to keep in mind is we as craft brewers have graduated from a Velveeta and Wonder Bread generation. So the criteria that the large brewers establish for the malt, the grains that they buy, malted barley, that they buy for malting, and farmers have to adhere to if they want to sell in the past, if they wanted to sell their malt, has a criteria for yield per acre. It has a criteria for disease resistance. It has a criteria for how erect the barley plants themselves are, but no criteria for flavor. So that's all telling. And in our case, all we want is flavor. We're concerned with yield per acre. We have to be. We're concerned with disease resistance and how to harvest the raw material. But really, our greatest goal and what we're all about is what is the flavor that we have. And we borrowed, what we like about Skagit Valley malting, we borrowed a page from the wine industry. I can remember a time when it was not typical for wineries to market varietal wines named after individual grape variety, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, Riesling. But now they wouldn't consider doing anything but that, talking about the terroir, the soil that the grapes are grown in, and what the resultant taste of the product is. And so we were among the first brewers to brew with Skagit Valley malt. And the first beer we came out was one we called Loca Ale, and we made it with Skagit Valley Alba variety barley. And to my mind, that's the first time that a single variety beer has been marketed, and it was very, very well received. Now we can't get Alba anymore.
I'd like to go back to the first question that was asked before we sort of diverged. I think one of the things that happened, and I came to this industry as truly a consumer with no knowledge of food to speak of until I met Charles. And had it not been for travel and the ability to travel, I would not have had that exposure. And Boeing, which is in our community, is probably responsible in some ways for the Pacific Northwest's ability to take on, learn about food and bring it to our market and learn to cook with it and brew with it and make wine. And I think that that's very influential. It definitely influenced the Pike Place Market because the market was very different when we moved here in 1974. You didn't have the variety that we have today.
Great, thank you.
So,
I want to switch gears just a little bit and ask a question about history. Again, you are brewers, you are entrepreneurs, maltsters. to what extent do you think about history in your work, whether that's history of a brewing style or a technique? How does history play into your work now?
I'm big on historical brewing. That's one of the things that I like to do the most is research older recipes and brewing methods and styles and incorporate that into my brewing. I'm a big fan of decoction brewing, which makes me not very popular in the brewing community because it takes a 4 or 5 hour day and turns it into a 12-hour day. But I like that. It's my favorite thing. So finding old recipes and reviving those. I love all the, I work at Pico Brew and we manufacture automated home brewing equipment and also machines for breweries and maltsters and hop growers. But I always like to turn back the clock because this is something, beer is 3,000 years old, so we have all these modern advances, but I'd like to go back to the roots because that's where it began. And you get that, and you can mimic that and bring it forward, then it really helps round out the experience for not only the brewer, but for the beer drinker.
Yeah, history, I think brewers all have a relationship with brewing history in ways that have developed over the last however long. I mean, really, there are the styles that grew up in the countries of their origin that sort of languished, that were then rediscovered by American home brewers and professional brewers. IPA was a style that was almost dead in Britain. I mean, the IPAs that were being produced there were anemic compared to the way they used to be. Same thing with barley wine and a number of other styles. These are things that were sort of dug up by home brewers and early craft brewers as early sources of inspiration. And then over time, of course, people sort of decided to twit history. They decided to build on history. They decided to do stronger versions of things and give them a new name or add another ingredient that tied in with something from history. And so history is always with us, even though in some cases you might not feel that when you're tasting a particular beer. But I think it's sort of a tennis game between American craft brewers and Belgium and Britain and Germany, and then we'll see a beer that's interpreted here that was originally brewed in Britain or in Belgium, and then they will take what we've done and build their own sort of reinterpretation of it. So there's always this feedback loop, and it's really interesting, and it's a little taxing to pay attention to all the different levels of it, but it's one of the things that bears attention as one pays attention as a consumer or as a brewer to what's going on with styles and new flavors and all that kind of stuff. There's nothing new, nothing truly new, but there are different layers of newness.
Yeah, one thing to be considered, other than just the taste of the beer, is the history and custom of drinking beer. What environment do we drink it in? The main environment is what we're doing tonight, drinking it with friends. And there's nothing nicer at a get-together to have a couple of beers and breaks the ice and makes everyone pleased to be with one another. And I'm not suggesting overconsumption at all. I'm just discussing consumption. But the customs of drinking beer, going to a pub, sitting down and having a beer, the kind of vessels that we drink it out of. Do we just drink it out of a can and throw it down, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am? Or do we pour it properly in a glass and admire the beautiful color and the nose and the flavor and the aftertaste? Well, hopefully the latter of those two. But right along with the flavor and the place that you drink the beer is a tremendous amount of history and artistry. When you have a commodity like beer that has been brewed as long as it has, you have a lot of people trying to slice the pie, sometimes very thinly, and you've got to create the better mousetrap. So you've got to come up with a better idea, and over a period of time, people have done exactly that. So we have in our microbrewery museum some items from the Griesedick Brothers Brewery in St. Louis, and their slogan was, "It's debitterized." Do you know what debitterized is?
I'm not sure, but I'm not sure I want to.
Water.
Debitterized means that they didn't use any hops. or happy beers, or all manner of slogans. But it is part of our culture to observe how people market beer and have marketed beer throughout history. They say the first advertisement was in Egypt for a beer called Lion Beer, and it was a bare-breasted woman that was advertising this Lion Beer, and that falls into the category, what else is new?
I think one of the interesting things about the history of beer and the malts that are produced is the sort of meshing of modern technology with the reverence for those old styles. And from a maltster standpoint, we often get asked to create malts that are really old in their nature and sort of dig back into creating something that existed some time ago that plays into these old styles of beer, yet they're oftentimes not really available. We were asked by one brewer to create what's known as a Fury malt, and it's, near as we can figure out, it's a malt that was produced hot right out of the kiln as it was finished. And according to our customer, no one's produced a Fury malt that anybody knows of for a couple hundred years. And it has to do with how the industry evolved and how large commodity brewing was there, malting is there, the technology had developed. So we were just fortunate. It happens to be a guy who's nearly one of our neighbors. He's right in the area. So right as that malt's at its hottest stage and we're ready to pop it out, he runs up and grabs that malt from us and brews a really cool beer. Just an interesting history that's kind of fun to recreate some of those things with sort of the technology and the controls that we have today. And we try not to be slaves to the technology, but try to use it to create some really fascinating products that probably aren't readily available.
How do you spell that?
I don't.
Fury.
Fury. Yeah.
Okay, I think interestingly, a lot of what you're describing is a kind of artisan approach to your work, whatever that might be. And we toss around the word craft in relation to beer these days. And so I wonder if, especially from the consumer's perspective, what does it mean to be craft, to be an artisan with relation to beer?
Well, originally the description, which I believe evolved right here in Seattle, where we had one of the first newspaper beer writers in the United States, Vince Catoni, and he described what we are as a microbrewery, which was probably a pretty descriptive term at that time, because all there were at that time were mega breweries. So a microbrewery was an apt description, but microbrewery doesn't really describe the quality so much as the size. The word craft brewery, in my opinion, is a much better word because it suggests that it is a craft, which definitely is. Artisan is a good word as well, but easier to say craft. So then now we have, you may be aware, crafty beers as well as craft beers. And the crafty beers are the ones that brewers that don't want you to know that they own the breweries. They want you to think that they're craft beers, but in fact they're multinational corporations, global companies that buy up these smaller breweries and market them under their own names. Those are the crafty beers.
Well, I think craft, no, I totally agree with what Charles says. But I think when people think about craft, they do think of the artisan. They think of some sort of identification with the hands-on method of creation. They think of the individual brewer mashing in, or the relationship they have with them when they drop by the place where the beer is made. And I'm really not even talking about from a modern perspective. I mean, the roadhouse breweries and the small artisanal breweries in Europe, there was a relationship between the people who made the beer and the people who drank the beer. And even when they got bigger, I think, that relationship was often maintained. You know, when they got to be sort of factory-sized, well, maybe that relationship was lost. And that puts a great deal, from a modern perspective, that puts a great deal of responsibility on a brewery as it gets bigger to maintain those kinds of connections with its community and with the people who consume it. And, you know, there are also obvious things that are lost when breweries are subsumed by larger multinational corporations, because it's pretty much impossible to maintain that sort of personal relationship with the creation of the beer. And it's a little bit of a slippery definition and a slippery concept, but that's really what it's about. If you think of a particular beer and you can imagine the person or the people who make it, whether you know them personally or not, and you really feel that kind of connection with it, that's really what craft is.
One thing that many brewers did as industrialization took place and breweries grew larger is they maintained a pub or a Gasthof or even a bowling alley in Belgium at their brewery. And that was an opportunity for the employees of the company, along with their customers, to gather together and have a pint, have some food along with that. In Bavaria, to sit under a big chestnut tree and enjoy Weisswurst and Weissbier and a pretzel. And so those establishments continue to this day, and they do give those large companies a little bit more heart than they would have if they were just brewing and doing nothing else.
Okay, great. I have a question to start with Annie, and then others, please feel free to contribute. But I wanted to ask about the homebrewing culture of Seattle. It's long been known to have a particularly vibrant homebrewing culture, and so I'm curious what unique perspectives and skills do homebrewers bring to Seattle brewing culture and to American brewing culture writ large?
Attitude. Homebrewers are a spirited bunch. I'll always be a home brewer. A lot of creativity. I myself, each year for the Homebrew Con, we always present our beers in a theme of a diner. So all of our beers are made with food. So I do Barry's laughing. He's a recovering home brewer, as I say. I make beers with pork chops and chicken and pineapple upside down cake. But just that diversity and creativity. And the homebrewing community in Seattle is very strong. I'm part of North Seattle Homebrewers, and I'm proud to say that we have many of our homebrewers that have opened up breweries, Bainbridge Island, Populux, Lucky Envelope, Lantern, Reuben. So the community is strong, and you know the relationship. Paul's here from the AHA, or excuse me, the Brewers Association, and also part of that is the American Homebrewers Association, which is very involved with the homebrew community and all the homebrew shops. So there's a great community. Excuse me, I'm a little loud. A great community, and the creativity mostly is what comes out of the homebrewing community. And it is a myth if you make your own beer at home that it's cheaper than to go out and buy it. Because I make a lot of beer at home, and I drink a lot of beer. I go out and buy a lot of beer, and I patronize a lot of breweries. So I hope that answers your question.
I moved to Seattle in 1990, and one of the first things I did when I got here was join a homebrewing club. I was a member of the Brews Brothers, and another really interesting thing I did early on, not long after I got my first job, is that I was invited to judge the offerings of the Boeing Wine and Homebrewing Club. I forget exactly what the name of it was, but I was amazed at the quality of the beer that these people who worked for Boeing were brewing. I mean, there's an enormously rich tradition. And another thing that I was surprised about, and I would report to people after I'd been to the first meetings that I went to of the Brews Brothers, was that there was a surprisingly high incidence of human beings among them. they weren't just geeks. They weren't just beer nerds. They were really interesting people who had a really varied background. And I think, honestly, I think that's one of the things that is a real strength for a group of homebrewers that you run into, and it's something that's lived on in the ranks of professional brewers, is that most of us, we have another life outside of that. Most people who started breweries had other careers first. And so some of us were photographers, and some of us were writers, and some of us were teachers and business people and aerospace engineers and whatever else. And so we have the perspectives of many other industries to bring to it. And it's something that makes the whole sort of the pool of intellectual sort of strengths that we all bring to it extremely varied. And I felt that when I joined that club, and I think you would join if you would see that in any homebrewing club. And it's one of the things that I think has sustained the diversity and the strength of our industry.
Yeah, I think I have a little different, interesting perspective on the homebrewers. As a malting company, certainly the homebrewers are busy on the internet, and they're digging into all the stories and the supplies and where they can get things. So it's not uncommon for us to see cars slowly circulating around the building, through our parking lot, tentatively looking in the windows, and eventually they work up enough courage to come in. And then they're asking, do we sell to the home brew? Do we sell to the public? And so, typically we've got time, and we walk them out to the malting floor, and we look at some machines. And so you can tell that level of enthusiasm, they're sort of losing. It's like one of the greatest days in homebrewers' life to see actually how malt is made, right? And so before we get done, shouldn't say this in public, but they'll leave with a bag of malt from our company. Because we know what's going to happen, right? Half of them are going to end up in the brewing industry someplace at some point. But they're super passionate and really, really are into what it's about. And obviously, like Annie said, they don't just drink their own beer. They drink a lot of craft brew from around the area. So it's super fun. They're just a great bunch of people.
Well, we came to brewing from home brewing. We bought a home brew supply store that had been founded in 1921, and with Liberty Malt Supply, we met a lot of home brewers and were able to connect with them. We had a homebrew U where we brought the likes of Charlie Papazian, Michael Lewis, Michael Jackson, all in to speak to the local home brewers, as well as help us learn to brew as well. But Pike Brewing was founded in a homebrew supply store.
All right, thank you. And I have found this in my research, certainly as I've traveled around, just many people talk about their own relationships to beer and brewing beginning in a basement or a garage, and it certainly it brings a kind of democratic and very personal component to this history that is so prevalent in all of many American places. I do want to give a chance to all of you to ask questions. There's so much collective knowledge and experience up here, and so please, if you have questions, raise your hand and I will find you and convey your question. Yes, please. So the question is for Annie. How has her identity as a woman impacted her experiences in the brewing industry where there are more men than women?
That's a really good question. For me, when I started homebrewing, it was just a hobby that I had a tremendous interest in it, and really good pushing from my mother to just go for it. So I never really thought about it so much as being a female, and until I started to go to homebrew meetings, and this is when I lived in Sacramento, and I knew I had something to say because I did my homework, and I was also taking some classes from Davis in fermentation science. But I was shut out because you're the chick, you don't know much. And so it caused me to start my own homebrew club, and it was me and one other guy. So I kind of closed off. But then once I started entering competitions and winning, then I started to get some recognition. It's funny how that happened in the homebrew community. I don't think it's like that anymore. But then when I really started to win big, I think people saw that, oh, she has something to say. And then I'm like, well, yeah, there's a lot of females that have a lot to say. And if you think about it historically, women were the brewers. So, it's, yeah. Reviving that and remembering that too historically. I mean, females were brewing for, to help their male partner in business and also just to brew for the homestead. So it was reviving that and just breaking barriers, but it had to be through winning competitions. That's how I had to do it. But I'm loving it now because I see so many women in the brewing industry that are just, they're opening up their own breweries. They're co-owners of breweries. There's Robin at Stoop. I'm a big fan of them. And then the Pink Boot Society has gone from just 10 members up to 5,000 members worldwide of all women in the brewing industry. So it takes time, but we're, pushing back the memory that we're here to stay.
What gets you up in the morning?
The dog barking.
Well, I, for one, love what I do, and I get up in the morning and I can't wait to come down here, right there, next to us, and there are so many things to do. There are so many employees that I love being around. The beer itself. Today we tasted a new IPA. That's always exciting. New food on the menu. New items of Breweriana in our collection. So I feel, and I speak for Roseanne, I know too, we consider ourselves very lucky because we do something that we love doing. And we have in our circle of friends a lot of people that are doctors and lawyers and other professional people, and I'm very respectful of what they do, but in my heart, I'm glad that I don't do that. And I'm very happy with what we do.
One thing I've always said that I really appreciated about the life as a brewer is that every day is different. There's a whole new set of challenges. There's some piece of equipment that maybe is going to break, or there's some day where everything goes, beautifully, and you've got a new beer to taste or to release or something like that, or you've got a little piece of writing to do or a label to work on. There's always something different. It's extremely varied. And, it's a creative enterprise. I think it's creative, but it also has to do with, one's command of the physical properties of the materials that one is using and the ways that equipment works and the people that you work with and all that stuff. I mean, there's just so much that's brought to bear on it. But the main thing is every single day is different. There's a different set of challenges and a different set of rewards.
Yeah, I think for me, besides the alarm clock and the dog, the thing that gets me up is it's really fascinating to be part of such a growing and thriving industry with so much passion. And so in the malting side of it, we interact with just a wide range of brewers, and they really, really bring this passion to their business. And there's lots of young folks involved in all this, and they're they're building a business and they're excited about what the opportunities are. So, there's plenty of things out there that are sort of past their prime and on their way down, and it's not too exciting to be part of that. But the craft brewing industry, and we're also part of the craft distilling industry, and it just really continue to explode, and new things happen all the time. So the newness of it and being part of something that's really changing is a heck of a lot of fun.
Well, Charles actually gets me up in the morning. But once I'm up, it's very exciting because we're in the hospitality business, so it's not just a day-to-day, mundane sort of activity. Every day is different. People we interact with are different. It's fun.
Yeah, I agree. I was fortunate enough to be able to turn a hobby into a career. So it's something I wish that everybody could do if you have something that you love. And just going to work. When I started with Pico Brew, we had one product, and now we're working on our 6th, and it's just been 4 years. So it's exciting, it's fun, it's challenging. There's a lot of beer, and a lot of smiling faces. There's a few I see tonight. So it's just great to be able to do something that you love, and get paid for it. It's kind of cool. That too.
One thing I'd like to say to everyone is all that glitters is not necessarily gold. So we have gone in my career time, from 2 craft breweries in America in 1978 when I began to sell beer, to what Paul reminded me earlier in the evening was almost 6,000 breweries around the United States. So no matter how much we love each and every one of those brewers, they all are competitors. And each one of those people are competing for tap handles. And each one of those people are competing for shelf space in the supermarket. And each one of those people are competing for share of mind of the media. So one of the things that happens is we're all forced to be better, to brew better beers, to be better marketers, to be more service-oriented. But I don't think collectively we want to paint a picture of you that this is, like falling off the proverbial log. This is hard work as well as something that we love.
Do we have one last question? Yes, right here in the middle. Great. So the question is about the influence of the hop industry here in the Northwest, in particular Burt Grant. The role of that ingredient in distinguishing beers of this region.
Go ahead, Charles.
Well, at the time that Burt Grant got into the beer, does everyone know who he is?
Please.
He's our first brewer in Washington State. He beat the Grant's Yakima Brewery, beat out Red Hook by about a month, I think, something like that. And he was a very idiosyncratic individual. His background was in the hop industry, and he was not a person that shied away from controversy. For example, he got into a big argument with the government over marketing cider, which as a brewer, we're not allowed to do in Washington State. But he said, to hell with you, I'm going to market cider. I'm from Washington State after all, and he did that, and he ultimately didn't as a result of his relationship with the government. But Burt Grant was one of these guys that was over the top, and he would go wherever he went, he would have a little dropper, and he'd order a Rainier, and he'd put a couple of drops of hop extract in there, just so he could drink a beer with some hops. So he came out, it's arguable whether his beers were wonderful or not, but he came out with what is, in retrospect, the first modern IPA in America. And that was about 1984. Is that right, Dick? 84. And he was resolute in his missionary activity to promote the idea that that hops were our indigenous crop. We are the largest hop producer in the world currently in the Yakima Valley. But what a lot of people don't know is we were the largest hop producer here in Puget Sound before hops went over to Yakima. And so I think hops, you know, we're right proud that we have hop fields not far away. And now as hops are, a lot of people think beer is made with hops. And you obviously don't. You care enough to come to a beer seminar, but the person on the street, as often as not, oh, you make that with hops, right? Well, we do, but malt is the heart and soul of the beer, and hops are the preservative and the seasoning of the beer. But we are in a fortunate position in regard to hops. We just are a hop, skip, and a jump, no pun intended, over to the Yakima Valley. And we feel good when we see people come here all the time, come to our pub from Illinois, from Vermont, from wherever in the United States or other parts of the world, because Yakima Valley sells worldwide, and come here to go to hop schools or visit hop merchants over there, hop growers. It's good.
I think that covers it very well. I mean, I think it's not to be underestimated, the development of the hop industry and the relationship between brewers and the hop growers and the hop brokers that's developed in the last few decades. I mean, you know, early on, we used to just call up our hop broker and order hops. And, you know, here in Washington, our guild would, you know, every year we'd go over and visit the growers just as sort of a social occasion. We'd go through the fields and we'd pull some cones off the vines and rub them and learn a little bit about that. And we kind of had the place to ourselves. And, you know, hops have become such an enormous part of beer consciousness that now, I mean, to go over to Yakima during the hop harvest now, it's some kind of carnival. It's a really fragrant carnival. I mean, the whole town smells like hops. And, you know, brewers from breweries all over the world show up there. And, you know, it used to be us, just one bus worth of people going over to take a look at them. And, of course, we'd run into people from, you know, early breweries that really paid attention to hops, you know, Sierra Nevada in particular. They always had a really, really highly developed sense of what was going on over there. And some of the other early craft breweries, New Belgium and Anchor as well. But, you know, now it's an amazing thing. It's like a fair to go over there. And, you know, it's something that's really gratifying, and new varieties all the time, and you know, the vagaries of the market, all that kind of stuff. It's difficult to describe. You really kind of have to see it. But it's one of the many things that's developed that's really a lot of fun for us in our industry.
One of the many things that makes this region completely unique among all American regions. So I want to end there. I want to thank you for your attention, invite you to fill up your glass. Remember to go to Pike Brewing at 8:30. I should also mention 8th generation, native owned and native designed, stayed open especially for us this evening. Thank you. And please give a final thank you to our panelists for being here.
I always feel like the